Today, October 22, is a very significant day in the history of our beginnings.
Welcome back to the Adventist History Podcast. This episode is called Epilogue. Last time, we talked about a Baptist farmer named William Miller who experienced a revival, studied the Bible, came to the realization that Jesus would return about 1843. Then we have a young married couple, James and Ellen White. Ellen claimed to have her first vision.
Washburn, what the haystack are you talking about, man?
That is right, my friends. We've arrived at the epilogue of Season 2, which continues the trajectory of this season to show why the Adventist Church is the way that it is today. Now, I want to warn you ahead of time that this episode is going to be unlike any other episode that we've had so far. We kind of did a little bit of an epilogue after Season 1, and because I thought I was going to stop there, and then it was a kind of a transitional episode between the seasons. But anyways, this one's going to be a little bit different, a little bit less complete, because I'm telling you the goal is to trace the trajectory of the season to just kind of bring us from 1980 to roughly the present. The problem with that is it's kind of hard to do because we have two reasons. We have no perspective on things that happened in the last 30 or 40 years. I mean, it's really, I shouldn't say no perspective. I should say perspective is really hard. It's hard to say, what is the significance of this event that happened in 2005 or that happened in 1995? We don't know all of the implications of that event because we haven't really had enough time to see how it's going to play out. Now, there may be some issues where, we can look at some smaller issues and say, all right, we've seen that one played out. We know what the significance of that issue is. But, the degree of confidence that we can make conclusions about the significance of certain things in Adventist history in the last 40 years is lower than it usually is. So that's one reason why this episode is going to feel incomplete. We don't have good enough perspective on the things that we're going to be talking about. The second thing is our sources are more limited. Okay, I could only do those Des Ford and Glacier View episodes because I had access to a ton of letters that people wrote back and forth to each other. If I only had to rely on what was written in ministry or the review or what was otherwise published, it would have been a very different set of episodes, much shorter and less insightful, I would say. When we talk about the last 30 or 40 years, many of these records are not accessible yet. They're still sealed, and there are some reasons of why this is. This is not an Adventist policy, okay? Don't blame the General Conference for this. This is just a standard operating procedure with some of these archival records. Time needs to pass before researchers are able to have access to them. So we don't have some of the same sources that we would have if we were dealing with things further in the past. We also have to grapple with a lot more rumor. There's a lot of people who say, I heard this happened, or somebody told me that happened. And without access to those deeper records, it's hard to evaluate how true some of those statements are. We also have a unique problem in that unlike letters that were mailed back and forth to each other, which, is a large base of the materials we have for stuff all throughout Adventist history, unlike those private letters, we, to my knowledge, don't have a policy regarding emails. Is there a requirement that GC presidents, vice presidents, union presidents have to keep their emails for the public record? Yeah, I'm going to guess no. And so it really begs the question of what is research going to look like in the future, maybe in 30 years when I retire. If I look back on the time that I'm living in right now, that you and I are both living in right now, what sources am I going to draw from? Am I going to go try to hunt down someone's Facebook profile? Will Facebook even be alive then? Who's keeping track of President so-and-so's Facebook posts, Twitter posts? It's X, whatever. It's Twitter. Okay, don't correct me. We all know it's Twitter. Their Instagram photos that they're uploading. Is someone saving all of these things? Now, there are some leaders who have, I know, printed off some of their emails that they think are historically valuable. I appreciate that. But we don't have the same records we had when dealing with stuff that we've dealt with in past episodes. So for those reasons, this is going to feel a little bit different. It's if there's one episode that is more likely to change over time, it'll be this one. So this isn't to say I'm intentionally trying to, withhold information or be wrong about anything. I'm still endeavoring to get the story right. But the sources that I have to rely on to get the story right are very different than the sources that I've used in the past. And that doesn't mean they're less reliable. It means I have less confidence in their reliability. Or I should say, I have less confidence in my ability to tell as complete a story based on a variety of sources than what I've had in the past. Okay, hope that makes sense. It's kind of boring stuff to get out of the way at the beginning. Let me just kind of get made up for a second here and say, this epilogue feels like the end of something. I have gone through this with my wife. It feels like I'm kind of going through a grieving process. And maybe that doesn't make sense to you, but because nobody died, right? It's a good thing. The podcast has gone on for 10 and a half years. It's amazing that I've been able to do something consistently for so long. But there is a little bit of grieving that this routine, this rhythm that has been a part of my life for so long it's not ending, but it's changing. I'm no longer looking at the 22nd of every month as like, oh, this is release day. It's just, I'm no longer, cramming the third week of the month every single month. So it's very different. But, we've also run out of story to tell. It's like, where do we go from here after this episode? And I'll answer that, especially as we get to the end. But look, I've said over and over again that these episodes are just my first draft. The beauty of a podcast over and against a book or any other kind of printed material is that I can keep updating these episodes as I learn and grow. You don't have to go buy the second edition of the book, third edition of the book, and so forth just to get my little updates. They're just given to you right here in this podcast. So the podcast is never finished. As soon as this episode is done, I'm going to go back and revise season 1, and it's going to be my second draft. Okay, I'll just call them 2.0, but it's my second draft of that period of Adventist history. Future seasons 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever, are going to do deeper dives into different topics in Adventist history that I can't do when I'm trying to move along with this chronological story. I would like to do seasons on theological controversies, on topics that maybe I felt like we could have spent a lot more time on that, like the health effort, all the sanitariums that were built, like just around the world. I feel like more there can be said. I'd like to do maybe a season on Adventist missions to a certain country. Okay, there's so many things that we can talk about in future season, and we will, and I'm excited about that. So I'm going to talk more about these future plans here at the end of the episode. So buckle in. It's a long journey. Just have a little bit more housekeeping to get out of the way here before we dive in. Big question getting into this was, what do we talk about? Not that we can't find something to talk about, but that there's too much to talk about. I asked the patrons what I should talk about. I received dozens of options, so I can't cover them all. It's not that they were bad suggestions. It's just too much, and it just feels. I don't want this episode to feel like it's just like a bag of popcorn. Where is this really the metaphor I want to use? Maybe I'll just do jelly beans, where everyone is a different flavor and they don't always work well together. I don't want it to be a bunch of randomness, where it's like here's a fact and here's a fact and here's a fact. Because if you're going to have over an hour long episode of randomness, it's a bit much. So I'm looking for stories to tell that bring us up to date, but that also are connected to each other, that tie into stuff that we've talked about before as well. So in order to do that, there's some facts, there's some stories I'm just gonna leave out, not because they're not important, just because of I can't connect it to things that we've already done, or just run out of time, guys. Just run out of time. I should spend 3 months just preparing for this one episode, but I can't. You get into a little bit of a rhythm here when you're doing like Glacier View, because you can go scan a bunch of stuff, and then for the next few episodes, I'm just going to be drawing from these sources. Then you get to an episode like this, and it's like everything. Go read all the reviews, and go read Ministry Magazine, and go read, all these blog posts, because the internet starts to play a role in Adventist history here. It's like drinking through a fire hose, to risk overusing that cliche. So what does this mean? It means I'm going to talk a lot about Glacier View, or post-Glacier View Adventist world, rather. But there isn't a lot of time to mention the genocide in Rwanda. I mean, the genocide in Rwanda was newsworthy, it was tragic, certainly deeply significant in the history of Adventism in Rwanda, in Africa. But it's too much of a deep dive to try to connect that to the global church and to the story that we've been telling thus far. So I say global church, but obviously, this podcast has a bit of an Anglosphere bent, not out of prejudice towards the rest of the world, but largely out of ignorance, because I don't know the local histories, the local Adventist histories of all the countries around the world. And sometimes to pause and say, let's go spend the next year jumping around the different countries, it feels like it's too much of an interruption. So this is another thing that I hope to address in future seasons of this podcast, to make it more expressive of global Adventism, more representative of global Adventism, rather than just kind of the European, American, and Australian Adventism that where most of the stories I've told take place. So, all right, one last reminder before we dive in. The goal of the Adventist History Project, which this podcast is a part of, along with our friends Michael Campbell and Greg Howell over at Adventist Pilgrimage, they're a part of this too, and also the Ellen White podcast, Adventist History Extra, those 4 podcasts, and all of our future endeavors. The goal of the Adventist History Project is to give a working knowledge of Adventist history to you, my friends. So if you've listened to all the episodes, I hope it has given you a historical perspective that has helped you navigate what it means to be an Adventist in the 21st century. And if by chance you're here listening, you're not an Adventist, but you're just hoping to understand Adventism, welcome. I don't know if I've welcomed you in a long time. I hope this has improved your religious literacy and awareness of a small, significant group of Christians. All right, let's go. All right, so we could spend 2 or 3 more episodes talking about the fallout from Glacier View. Let's just get that out of the way right away. I decided instead to just treat it as one segment among many in this epilogue episode. This wasn't an easy decision because the story doesn't feel like it's complete, right? Like, what happened? Ford was fired. Then what? It must feel a bit like seeing Frodo throw the One Ring into the fires of Mount Doom in Lord of the Rings and then walking away. What happened next? Was Middle-earth saved? What about Gondor? What is Peter Jackson's Return of the King without 27 minutes of endings? You can't just turn it off when the ring falls into the crack of doom, Matthew. Wait, what were we talking about again? Anyways, for those who need some kind of ending, all I can say is head over to the website, subscribe to Adventist History Extra. I have an hour-long aftermath episode for you. It's an hour long, and it just covers things that happened post-Glacier View from August to December 1980. Now, I may add to this at time, and so Adventist History Extra may be the place you want to go if you want to get more episodes post-Glacier View and you want to kind of just chase the tail of that Des Ford saga. But there's several reasons why I didn't want to do 2 or 3 more episodes here on the main podcast. First, I don't think knowing every detail helps us any more than knowing some of the details. There's some diminishing returns. The more time you want to spend with this story, it's still a lot of work to do it. And I think everyone gets the point. But the second reason is that 12 episodes is enough on Desmond Ford and Glacier View. It's enough to help you reason and make conclusions and decide how this helps you live Adventistly today, okay? 12 episodes. It's a whole year focused on one person, one saga. That's more episodes than I have spent on any other event in Adventist history. So to go on and on about him risks sending the message that Des Ford is more important than Jones and Wagner, the 1919 Bible Conference, race relations in the church, and other subjects that I just don't spend as much time on. It's certainly a significant event in shaping the church that we have today, but again, I can end up sending a message based on how much time I spend on any one subject, and I think, like I said, I think that you get the point. So you can head over to Adventist History Extra and listen to the Aftermath episode and maybe some future episodes I may do covering the tail end of the Desmond Ford saga there as well. Now, I will say we do have to talk about some of the tail end of Desmond Ford because we're trying to trace our story from 1980 to the present. So we have to talk about it a little bit, but it's just not going to be 2 to 3 episodes worth. Now, I will say this. If you're wondering what's the difference between Epilogue and Aftermath in terms of Desmond Ford, two different stories. 2 different stories. I'm going to share stories here I didn't share in Aftermath, and Aftermath is full of information that I'm not sharing here. So if you want to listen to both, you'll get a more complete picture. So, all right, back to that student at Southern Missionary College. He wrote, quote, "How does all of this affect us who are quietly and perhaps ignorantly plowing along here at SMC?" End quote. Another student trying to survive college asked, quote, "Who is Desmond Ford and why is there so much controversy?" End quote. I think both of these statements by these students remind us that while I may do 12 episodes on Desmond Ford and Glacier View, and while those who are kind of in the know may want to argue about these things, many Adventists are just trying to live their lives, man. They don't really care. They don't really see the relevance for what's happening in Colorado, or the controversy surrounding Walter Ray. Not everybody cares about these things. And I think I bring these 2 students up just as a way of reminding ourselves that sometimes the machinations, the drama that happens at the top of the church, we can assume that like everyone is always absorbed by it. Everyone is captivated by it. And they're not. They're not. I would say relatively few people care enough to be following every pitch that happens in that game. Now, should be noted, of course, it was still a significant event. In the student newspaper there at Southern Missionary College, the Southern Accent acknowledged that some people might be disturbed by the rumors and news reaching them about Glacier View. You have to appreciate that in the immediate aftermath of Glacier View, few people knew exactly what had happened. The Accent recommended that students just keep their eyes on Jesus and not, quote, label with criticism one of the 2 participants in the discussion, end quote. It also warned that while being quick to judge, just based on incomplete information, so-and-so's a heretic or the church is wrong, while being quick to judge might provide, quote, short periods of inner satisfaction, they quickly gave way to despair, end quote. It's kind of a weird comment to throw out there. But the idea is there's no virtue in being quick to judge without having all of the information. Just keep your eyes on Jesus and go back to class, right? Of course, Pacific Union College's student paper, the Campus Chronicle, put a photo of Desmond Ford on its front page with the headline, "Ford Defrocked." Eric Anderson, fresh off his PhD at the University of Chicago, beginning his teaching career at PUC, I believe, wrote a letter to the editor, quote, "The Campus Chronicle's thorough reporting puts to shame the Adventist Review, Pacific Union Recorder, and other publications," end quote. That's high praise for a student paper. But Kevin Paulson, a student at PUC, was utterly unimpressed with the paper's coverage. Right next to Anderson's letter to the editor, he writes, quote, "It appears to me that the Chronicle staff is determined to convince our student community of the utter unimportance of these critical issues," end quote. Paulson believed the student body should celebrate Dez's firing, writing, quote, "The Advent truth, victorious once more over its opponents, is destined to triumph gloriously," end quote. Another student who worked as a groundskeeper on campus recalled feeling discouraged being so far from his home country at one point. Then one day, a professor came racing by, walking fast, and with a few kind words transformed the student's perspective about where he was in life at that moment. Quote, "His name? Desmond Ford. And now he's been defrocked. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they did," end quote. Among the faculty at PUC were those who personally respected Des but didn't necessarily buy all of his conclusions. Among those were someone we met before, Wayne Judd, an assistant professor of religion. And after Des moved nearby to begin his new ministry, Good News Unlimited, Wayne Judd, Adrian Zykotsky, Eric Anderson, and Bill Price decided to go cheer Des up. He had moved not too far away from them. They may not have agreed with all of Des's theology, but they liked Des personally, and they all did agree that he had been treated shabbily by the church. So they piled into Adrian's new Volkswagen Jetta, and Wayne grabbed a hymnal to take on the way. Now, flipping through the hymnal during the hour-and-a-half drive, the group wrote parodies of well-known hymns to poke fun at the church in light of the Desmond Ford situation. Unfortunately for you, I am not a great singer, but I will risk infinite and everlasting shame to give you a sample of one of these songs anyway. This one is called Rust and Obey, obviously adapted from Trust and Obey, and it goes something like this. When we work for the church, we'll be left in the lurch. If we choose Wilson's creed not to sign, while we do Wilson's will, work abides with us still, and with all who will rust and obey. Rust and obey, for there's no other way to avoid unemployment than to rust and obey. I'll see you guys at the Grammys, my friends. I'll be outside uninvited. Des was amused by the parodies, and so was PUC's newest quartet. When they got home, they recorded their parodies under the label of the Sudden Sound Singers from Keene, Texas, chivalrously, selflessly trying to cast off suspicion by placing it on Southwestern Adventist University instead. I mean, you guys could have been from anywhere. Attempts at avoiding detection were futile because the group, it seems to me, was so enamored with themselves. When they got back, they went house to house around the campus of PUC, to the faculty housing around, singing their songs to cheer up like-minded faculty. They sang for Walter Utt and for Fred Veltman and for others. But at one house, the windows were open, and the conservative college registrar heard the music carrying on the autumn air. Hiding in the bushes to watch Wayne and his friends leave, the registrar was able to report them to the president, Jack Castle, who, shall we say, was less than pleased at what he called their sophomoric parodies. Castle had a good reason to be frustrated. He said, quote, "This Ford business has already given the college a bad name," end quote. And Wayne Judd later wrote, quote, "If the administration and board had found out the real purpose of our parodies, we would all have been fired on the spot," end quote. The real purpose of the parodies, of course, was to go cheer Desmond Ford up in person. Right? If that had gotten out, Wayne Judd is saying, we would have all been fired on the spot, and all of their careers may have had a different trajectory. All because they, not so much because they went to go cheer Desmond Ford up. They could have done that quietly and returned, but the fact that they went from house to house afterwards, the fact that they sang in a house where the windows were open, apparently oblivious to the potential danger there, and the fact that they decided to record an album of them singing these parodies, all just flirts with disaster. And Castle certainly had cause for concern when he's like, look, we've already got a black eye from this Ford situation. If it gets out that 4 of our faculty went to go visit Desmond Ford in person and sang songs mocking Neil Wilson in the church, like that is something that's a crisis for Pacific Union College. That's maybe they were already in a crisis. That's a greater crisis. That's at a whole different level. And who knows where it would have gone, but it could have spelled the doom for the school, certainly for Jack Castle and for those faculty. Now, if you think that this experience of nearly being fired might teach the group something about, not wanting to be professionally decapitated, you would apparently be wrong, because they not only did all of these things, but they sent their recording and lyrics to friends at Andrews. And one of the professor's wives there made copies of the lyrics, and Wayne apparently was later shocked to find that the words circulated by Wayne Judd had apparently been written at the top. Now, this was especially distressing because one of the songs referred to the new seminary dean with an extremely offensive epitaph. Wayne got so many angry letters over the next few years that one day when no angry letters arrived, he and his wife celebrated an impromptu holiday with some pizza. Now, Des's firing wasn't the end of his relationship with denominational leaders. They would meet several times in the years following Glacier View, but these meetings culminated in 1983 with the removal of Des's ministerial credentials. Neil Wilson told Des that after several meetings, the two sides were, quote, further apart than was the case at the time of the Glacier View meeting, end quote. Neil made it clear that the church wasn't judging Des's Christianity, only his Adventist orthodoxy, if that distinction made any difference to him. Quote, we are left with no alternative but to advise the Australasian Division to proceed to deal with your case as a minister of the church as seems best to them. I repeat that I find no pleasure in this. I feel nothing but the deepest sorrow and regret and wish with all my heart things could have been otherwise. In doing what we feel bound to do, we do not want to cut off communication with you. You and Jill are still persons, precious people whom I love in Jesus Christ, end quote. Ford responded with a longer letter repeating many of the claims he had been making for several years now. And if his main point is that if divergence from prophetic interpretation, quote, is sufficient to jeopardize one's position in the Adventist community, end quote, then how do you explain Roy Allen Anderson's book, All Eyes on Israel? Des called Anderson, quote, one of the greatest men among us, end quote, but noted that his book, quote, takes a flagrantly different position on prophecy from that of the church in general, end quote. And again, I think Des' strategy here, one of his strategies that he employed for many years since, he's doing it again here, which is, you're charging me with this thing, but why are you picking on me and not this other person who's doing the exact same thing? So around in 1980, it would have been, why are you picking on me for my Adventist Forum talk when Ray Cottrell's Adventist Forum talk a few months later was, I don't know, how do I put it here? It was more egregious in terms of breaking with Adventist tradition. So why is he not in trouble? Why is he actually invited to the Sanctuary Review Committee to judge me when he has said the same things I've said and has gone even further in some ways than I have gone? And so here's Des again in 1983 saying basically the same thing. If I'm in trouble for divergence from prophetic interpretation, then why is Roy Allen Anderson not in trouble for the same thing? He calls it a flagrantly different position on prophecy. Nevertheless, what are you going to do, right? I mean, it's not that those arguments had never really gotten anywhere. So Des accepted what he couldn't control. Quote, I happily remain a Seventh-day Adventist, whatever happens to my membership and my love for the church, its God-given truth, its people, and its leaders is not diminished, end quote. On June 12, 1981, 17 Adventist teachers from 7 Adventist colleges and universities met in Atlanta to discuss the implications of Glacier View for the church's scholars. The group released a statement affirming their belief in the Seventh-day Adventist mission and message, right? Don't worry, we're still loyal, but they worried about the post-Glacier View church. They feared that, quote, loyalty to the church is now often measured with references to certain personalities or publications rather than to Scripture, end quote. They also noted that confidence in the seminary was being eroded, that the review and ministry were offering one-sided perspectives, and that both critics and apologists for the church are being divisive, and that all of this is having an effect on their students. So, just a couple of things to talk about. The group recommended that, quote, teachers, pastors, administrators, and other members attempt now to stop the polarizing process that threatens our unity and future, end quote. They lived in a time of polarization. Totally can't relate to that. The statement became known as the Atlanta Affirmation. Richard Rice, one of the signers, said, quote, we must pluralize and complicate what Adventism is, end quote. He was, of course, doing that single-handedly at Loma Linda with his new views on open theism. His book had been printed by the Southern Publishing Association, and then it was canned. Everyone, just calm down. That's the message of the Atlanta Affirmation. It was signed by some familiar suspects. Larry Garrity, Jerry Gladson, Lorenzo Grant, Jack Provenza, Richard Rice, Charles Scriven, Fred Veltman, Ed Zagerson, and Adrian Zajkowski, just to name a few of the 16 who signed it. I say 16 and not 17 because apparently Norman Gully signed it, but then asked for his name to be taken off. Why might Gully have taken his name off? Well, the Atlanta Affirmation was viewed by some church leaders with suspicion. The issue wasn't so much the content of the declaration, but the idea that scholars would gather without church approval to address these problems on their own. And so the Atlanta Affirmation further complicated the Adventist landscape in the post-Glacier View years, where it wasn't yet clear what the implications of Glacier View were going to be. And so people were stepping out, making statements, taking action, trying to establish a kind of a whatever they wanted to see as the new normal. And so these 17 scholars gathered in Atlanta hoping to just establish a new normal, basically telling some of the church leaders, the church's apologists especially, many of those could be lay people who were trying to attack Desmond Ford and defend the church, to just calm down, right? Everyone just calm down. And the same thing to maybe some of Ford's followers, everyone just calm down. Things are getting too polarized. We all just need to just settle down here a little bit. Now, Richard Rice's call for a wider understanding of what it meant to be an Adventist received a response in the review. Neil Wilson approved a meeting called Consultation 2. Now, the first Consultation 1, happened between scholars and administrators immediately after Glacier View. We talked about that a little bit in the final Glacier View episode, that it happened immediately, starting Friday night after Ford and the administrators had talked. And so that was the first consultation. And now, just over a year later, a second meeting was to be held between September 30th and October 3rd in Washington, D.C. Neil posed some questions in the review, which he hoped the scholars could answer. And I'm going to give you 3 of these questions that he posed. 1, quote, who decides what is proper to be taught in Adventist institutions and what should be avoided? 2, are some doctrines considered central and some tentative or peripheral? 3, is it healthy to have pluralistic views expressed in college Bible departments? End quote. Now, these were and are, I think, important questions, and the prize of Consultation 2 was that elusive, healthy relationship between administrators and scholars that many on both sides deeply desired. If you listen to the Adventist History Extra episode Aftermath, then you heard one professor's comment after Glacier View that he felt the scholars had been prostituted, that was his word, by the administration. They were brought to Glacier View to give the appearance of deep study and to reinforce a narrative and then return to their box no longer useful. A year after Glacier View, Desmond Ford was looking more and more like a moderate, however. Robert Brinsmead and even some of Ford's followers had been dismantling the Sabbath, Ellen White, other distinctive doctrines in a rush towards evangelicalism. Now, I know that's kind of a big statement, but this is an era where we start seeing some congregational Adventist churches disconnected from the church. They want to be Adventist, more evangelical Adventist, but they want a congregational model of church governance. So they were experimenting with this. Some of Brinsmead's people, some of Ford's people were experimenting with establishing some of these congregational Adventist churches. And of course, you know, the popular Adventist mind, as we all do as naturally as human beings, we tie Ford to his followers. We tie Brinsmead to his followers. We judge the leader based on what the followers decide to do. And Ford's oft-repeated statement that Adventist scholars all secretly supported him further destroyed the confidence of many in Adventist higher education, particularly departments of religion at our school. So there was a great need for administrators and for scholars, for teachers to be meeting and iron out some of this stuff. Didn't help, of course, that Ken Wood, editor of the Review, had published an infamous editorial. And I guess, you know, I don't really have to say anything else because we've seen already that if there's a delicate relational problem in the church, Ken Wood is going to publish an editorial and make it more complicated. So he stated, quote, "We confess that we are alarmed by the fact that some of our colleges seem to be drifting away from the standards and objectives established for them by their founders. We are alarmed by the secular climate that prevails on some campuses. We are alarmed by the strange winds of doctrine that blow on some campuses. We are alarmed by the lax moral standards that prevail on some campuses," end quote. Wood then quoted Ellen White as saying Adventist parents shouldn't send their kids to Battle Creek College, implying that conscientious Adventist parents might do the same today. The blowback on this editorial was massive, and that's a story for another time. It landed Wood into some serious hot water, and of course, college university presidents and their faculty were not super psyched about it either. And again, this just drove that wedge between administrators and academics and people associated with the higher educational side of things in the church, because it didn't really offer any exceptions. Wood's editorial didn't mention the good things that were happening. It's just, we've heard rumors, we've heard reports that all these things are happening, and it alarms us. And so take and do with that information as you see fit. So it seemed to many in higher education, this was a very irresponsible editorial that just stirred a bunch of people up to further mistrust and be angry with Adventist colleges and universities, even without any specific charges being laid against anybody. So again, this complicates the relationship between these educators and administrators in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Years later, Wood, however, would defend his editorial, saying, quote, "We shouldn't get to the place where we feel threatened when somebody says, 'Are we doing everything in the best way possible?' That's really all that I was saying," end quote. No, that wasn't all that you were saying, my friend. The problem wasn't Wood's expectation that Adventist schools should be Adventist, but that it offered a uniformly negative view of Adventist colleges and universities based purely on rumors and reports. Being written when it was written, it also exacerbated the growing mistrust between scholars, members, and administrators. If you just wanted to write an article, buddy, that said, "Are we doing everything in the best way possible?" Like no one in the entire history of the Adventist educational system is going to say there's ever been a point where we're doing everything in the best way possible. That's never been the case. If you send out a survey to every single Adventist member and said, "Are we doing everything we possibly can to bring the gospel to the world?" everyone's going to say no. If you say, "Are our schools doing everything they can to offer the best possible education?" everyone's going to say no, because the standard then is everything the best, and it's never going to be the best. So his later comments just strikes me as entirely disingenuous. He moved the goalpost. That wasn't what that article was about at all. And I'm not going to buy it. This is the context within which 200 administrators and scholars gathered for consultation 2. And Neil, just as he did at Glacier View, informed everyone that people wondered why the church even spent this money gathering with these scholars. It should be spent on evangelism instead. By the way, those people are still with us. I think those people have been with us since the beginning. It's like, why do you need a phone? Spend that money on evangelism as well. Look, I appreciate where they're coming from, but Neil wanted the people at consultation to understand that he didn't have to have this meeting, that there were a lot of people who didn't want him to have this meeting. And the reason why I say this was familiar, if you don't remember, was that the same thing happened at Glacier View, where he said that he had traveled to Eastern Europe, and people there were saying, basically, just declare Ford guilty. There's no reason to have a meeting and spend all that money, right? So just like at Glacier View, Neil here is saying, we need to have the meeting anyway. He saw it as vital, and then he said, quote, "All of us know that the church cannot go forward where feelings of misunderstanding, suspicion, doubt, and distrust exist. The Lord cannot bless us when we begin to argue among ourselves and to distrust one another," end quote. Well, how did the church get into such a state, I wonder? Neil laid the blame at the feet of scholars, saying that their intellectual conditioning, that's his phrase, leads them to say and write things that distress church members at times. They ask questions, but they don't always provide their own convictions. And so when rumors of questions being asked in the classroom gets out, it upsets people, it undermines confidence in what's being taught at these schools. But Neil also laid some of the blame at the feet of administrators as well. He says sometimes they had arrived, quote, at hasty conclusions about the loyalty and commitment of teachers without even talking personally with the individuals concerned, end quote. In his opening remarks, Neil acknowledged that he hadn't communicated well about the agenda of the meeting. Papers weren't sent out ahead of time. The agenda wasn't sent out ahead of time. People didn't know what to expect, and that led to some of the anxiety of like, oh boy, what are we in for when we show up? But he says, quote, "You can blame me. I did not seek a lot of counsel, but I have become aware of a number of key questions from my own observations in the last couple of years. Unless we face them honestly and openly, we will have continual difficulties," end quote. Neil said that he had 3 objectives for Consultation 2. First, to figure out what academic freedom means. Second, to determine what method of Bible study Adventist scholars should use. Can they borrow from the principles the evangelicals were using? What about those principles being used in secular institutions, especially this historical critical method? Third, what is the best way of firing teachers and preachers? Now, I wasn't present for that question, but I would have voted for defenestration. I think that's the best way to fire somebody. The schedule was much like Glacier View. The delegates gathered for a plenary session in the morning. They joined one of the 10 study groups or discussion groups until about 3 p.m., when the groups would then report. There were no evening meetings. It was definitely a lot more low-key, less tense than Glacier View. And at one point, Jack Pravancha, who had attended the meeting which produced the Atlanta Affirmation, expressed his frustration. Quote, "I was amazed and saddened to see such an event interpreted almost instantly as hostile in intent without any recognition of the sincere motivation of the participants," end quote. But an hour and a half later, Neil responded to Jack Pravancha with real emotion. Quote, "If the scholars wanted to bring healing, they did not set a very good example," end quote. Indicating a copy of the Atlanta Affirmation next to him, Neil continued, quote, "No one contacted me personally about this document," end quote. And it seems that it was there that it became clear to scholars that Neil was personally hurt, especially by minutes of the meeting which had been stolen and leaked by a so-called loyal Adventist trying to defend the church. Alden Thompson captured the moment well when he wrote, quote, "One thing was painfully clear, however. The Adventist underground press was working incredible mischief. Regardless of whether it was attacking the administration or academia, it was blurring the distinction between the public and the private. It was robbing us of the privilege of praying out our bitterness, of tearing up our tainted notes and speaking peace," end quote. The next day, Wilson said the Adventist Church stood at the crossroads. He believed the church was largely conservative, but not extremely conservative. He opened his heart that he was concerned about where the church would go. Would Adventism join mainstream Christianity in adopting the historical critical method of interpreting the Bible? Wilson noted a number of positions scholars had taken. One had told him that without the historical critical method, Ellen White could only be understood as a liar. Others told Wilson that if our pioneers used the historical critical method, we never would have the message that we have. So which way do we go? Wilson also said that the church had rejected inerrancy, even if some Adventists still believed it. Adventists didn't fit into any hermeneutical camp because there was no coherent Adventist hermeneutic. So which way will we go? Don McAdams, president of Southwestern Adventist College, now a university, stood to his feet and said, "Now I know why we're here." Some felt that this is where Ellen White could help. Surely there was no clearer example of the human and the divine working together than in Ellen White. Clear example because, well, we know a lot about Ellen White and her life, and we don't know as much about Isaiah in the Bible or Moses in the Bible. Studying how Ellen White was inspired could help us understand how biblical authors were inspired. So a consensus began emerging that rejected both verbal inerrancy and the historical critical method. Wilson seemed to favor calling an Adventist hermeneutic historical analysis, and this is a question that would be studied and lead to the 1986 Methods of Bible Study document and beyond. That's a whole storyline we're not going to be able to trace. The final question that they discussed, of course, was on what grounds someone should be fired. Did they vote for defenestration? Sadly, no. What if a teacher or preacher believes in liberation theology, theistic evolution, denial of Noah's flood? This was discussed, but not in the same detail, it seems to me, as other questions. At least I don't have as much reporting on how that conversation went. But I think, again, it's a good question to ask, right? Like, what constitutes a red line where a teacher has gone from, kind of an accepted variance in theology, like, oh, he's a little bit different in interpreting the seven seals than somebody else is, but he's still a good Adventist. At what point do you cross the line in your presence in the classroom is no longer affirming the Adventist faith in a way that the body of Adventists can approve of? Well, recognizing the hurt between himself and Jack Provenza, Neil Wilson asked Jack to close the Thursday meeting with prayer. It was a small moment. I mean, just asking someone to pray doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but you have to understand when you get to this level of things, all of these little things are significant. Everyone there understood it as an olive branch towards reconciliation. Jack Provenza was hurt that the blowback against the Atlanta Affirmation was so fierce that nobody seemed to appreciate what the scholars were trying to do there. Neil Wilson was hurt that as, the patriarch of the church, no one bothered to kind of give him a heads up that, hey, the scholars are going to be meeting and we're trying to, would it be helpful if we issued this kind of statement? Would this help bring healing and so forth? Lowell Bach, a General Conference vice president, said a bridge had been built at Consultation 2. He said that it was a, quote, good walking bridge, even if it probably wouldn't take a 10-ton truck, end quote. At Consultation 2, some scholars complained to Neil about a book that had come out a few months before. Neil, if you want to put away divisive tendencies in the church, if you really want church unity, the last thing you want to do is endorse that book. The book was called Omega, and it was written by an Adventist lawyer named Lewis Walton. I remember seeing this book in a number of churches when I became an Adventist. Omega was deeply controversial from the moment that it appeared. Rather than seeking to pacify the growing conflict between Adventists in the wake of Ford, Davenport, and Ray, just as the Atlanta Affirmation had tried to do, everyone settled down. Instead, Walton saw the fulfillment of prophecy in the conflict, in the polarization. Omega focused on the early 1900s and some comments Ellen White made during the heyday of the church's conflict with John Harvey Kellogg, that this constituted the alpha of heresies and an omega would soon follow. As Walton characterized it, Ellen White had predicted that, quote, under the banner of new light, powerful forces would seek to bend the Church of God into some unrecognizable new shape, end quote. In case you thought Walton was being a little too vague here, he explained what he meant. Confusion and hypocrisy in the church were, quote, the invariable result of an attack on the sanctuary or the investigative judgment, end quote. Now, Walton doesn't mention any names, but then again, he doesn't have to. Omega reads like a Dan Brown novel. At 100 pages, it is punchy, it is forceful, it is a soul-stirring read. I mean, you can't help but kind of get worked up reading this book. It reads like a novel. You can't help but feel the urgency of Lewis Walton's words. He concludes rather grandiosely, rather dramatically, that after the Alpha controversy had settled down, then we had the catastrophe of the First World War. Walton says that all of this happened because Adventists had allowed the devil to trick them back then, and he asks, would we allow the devil to win this time too? So, put all this together, guys. Lewis Walton is arguing in Omega that this Alpha controversy was with John Harvey Kellogg, and that Ellen White had prophesied that there would be an Omega to come. And he is suggesting that this Omega of heresy is here. I mean, how else do you explain Walter Ray and his challenge to Ellen White? How else do you explain Desmond Ford? How else do you explain the embarrassment of the Davenport scandal? It provided an answer to those members who were frustrated and confused by this explosion of conflicts and controversies which were shaking the church in the early 1980s. It seemed to offer a reason why things were happening that way that they were happening. And of course, the challenge was, are you going to allow it to happen or are you going to fight? So rather than, like I said, like the Atlanta statement saying everyone calm down, Lewis Walton is saying, no, we need to be up in arms. We need to be angry about this. And this was the explanation that a lot of people accepted. In the first 6 months of printing, Omega went through 6 editions and sold 66,800 copies, which, may not put a huge dent in the New York Times bestseller list, but by Adventist standards, that is a lot of copies of a book. Ken Wood, naturally, wrote the introduction to Omega, and the Review and Herald published it. Harold Otis, Tom Davis, Richard Lesher, Ron Wisby, Ray Woolsey, Arthur White, and Mervyn Maxwell were the ones who agreed to read the book before publication and provide some feedback. Whatever their feedback was, they failed to prevent the book from flying off the press like a missile. Omega was mailed to all the pastors in North America and then to union and division presidents overseas. Walton was also given space to make his case in Wood's Adventist Review, which he used to warn about how the old Battle Creek Sanitarium had been, quote, infiltrated with brilliant, charismatic persons who, beneath a veneer of professed loyalty, actually had little use for Ellen White, end quote. Again, he's warning of infiltration in the church, just as it happened back in the Alpha of Heresies, where there were brilliant, charismatic people who pretended to be loyal to the church. And so here at the Omega, at the end of time, don't trust everybody who says that they are loyal to the church. Behind the scenes, Donald Yost, director of the GC Archives, objected to the book on September 19, 1981. He was joined by fellow archivist Bert Holoviak. Bob Spangler met with Holoviak and Yost 3 days later to talk about their concerns. Yost said that, quote, the style of writing is unique in our denomination, end quote, and Spangler asked what Yost thought of the style of writing. What do you mean by it's unique? What do you mean by that? And Yost was blunt. He said, quote, I think it's dishonest, end quote. Another person there wasn't convinced. Are we quibbling over writing style? And this guy said, quote, it's written like a novel. Doesn't he have license to write a novel? End quote. Yost scoffed at one line Lewis had written in particular, where he called Kellogg, quote, an intense little man in a white suit, end quote. Surely this sensational way of writing is unbecoming for a Seventh-day Adventist author. Writing style aside, Holoviak attacked the central thesis of the book, that Ellen White had predicted an Omega heresy to happen towards the end of time. Quote, Mrs. White doesn't see the Alpha and Omega as an end-time thing, end quote. Holoviak and Yost were united that Ellen White's few comments on the Alpha and Omega don't apply to the present, that she doesn't fully explain what she meant, and that Walton was inserting out-of-context statements to develop this Omega concept into something much bigger than Ellen White ever made it. Yost lamented that, quote, at the present there is an admitted gap between scholars and administrators. This book has the potential of widening the gap, end quote. When Lewis Walton arrived in Washington, D.C. some weeks later, he was met by reports that Donald Yost and Bert Holoviak were about to discredit his book at a colloquium that weekend. Walton brushed it aside. Quote, I encounter challenges like that 5 days every week, end quote. Responding to Yost's critique that Walton hadn't formed an accurate picture of the Adventist history from which he drew his conclusions, Walton scoffed, quote, neither you nor the others who are attempting to criticize the book's accuracy have any idea of the extent of my personal library, end quote. Walton couldn't understand why Yost was so deeply opposed to his book. Quote, why do you seem to be trying so hard to discredit a book that merely reasserts God's evident supernatural guidance of his church, end quote. This reminded me of what Ken Wood said about his article on Adventist colleges, right? Like, I was only trying to say that we're not trying our best. Don't you think we should be trying our best? And here's Walton characterizing his book. I'm only saying that God is still guiding his church. Like, nobody would disagree with that, man. Nobody would disagree with that God is still guiding his church. This is not a summary of what your book is about. Your book is about that the fact that Ellen White had predicted an Omega of apostasy, and that there in the early 1980s, we are living through it. This is the last days, and we need to fight to make sure we don't succumb to this heresy. Like, your book is not just about God superintending his church, and reducing it to that one line that nobody could possibly argue with is exactly the same thing Ken Wood did. So let's just call the thing what it is, okay? Seminary professors split on the issue too. Perhaps the strongest voice objecting to Walton's book was Robert Johnston, who had a verbal joust with Mervyn Maxwell on the subject. Maxwell conceded that Walton's book wasn't always historically accurate, but said the history was, as he put it, adequate for his purpose, for Walton's purpose, and he called the book a tract for our times. In other words, look, let's not quibble over every detail. The point is his message accurate or not? Is it something we need to hear right now or not? Both Johnston and Walter Utt reviewed Omega for Spectrum. Johnston focused on theological claims of the book and especially its target, which he identified as Desmond Ford. Specifically, I guess, I quote Johnston directly here, and he said, quote, "The target is not only Desmond Ford and his disciples, but everyone else not in sympathy with the perfectionistic wing of Adventism, as well as most reflective thinkers and scholars within Adventism," end quote. Johnston noted how Ellen White's pair of cryptic statements about a coming Omega had been the source of speculation ever since she made them. Judson Washburn attacked Daniels in a tract he had entitled The Startling Omega, right? Remember that? Good old times with Washburn. Man, I miss that guy. Washburn later saw the fulfillment of the Omega in another event that I probably didn't mention in the podcast, and perhaps he had other interpretations of the Omega as well, which led Willie White to remark that, quote, "I think there are not less than 12 different things that have been urged by good-hearted brethren as the Omega," end quote. Johnston urged that Ellen White use some form of this alpha-omega concept to indicate cause and effect. When she wrote her Alpha statement in 1904, the church had not yet seen the full effect of Kellogg's departure, which ultimately drew him, his brother Will, E.J. Wagner, A.T. Jones, and many others out of the church. This, Johnston argues, is all Ellen White meant, that during the controversy, she shuddered at the thought of how this was going to end. She knew it was going to be painful. She knew it was going to take a number of people outside the church, and this was going to hurt. And so her Alpha Omega statement is simply her kind of trying to brace the church for impact. Johnston indicts Walton for mismatching Ellen White quotations and shaping them for whatever point he wants to make. And ultimately, however, Johnston blames Adventist readers. Quote, "The sad truth is that there is something in the psyche of many Adventists that craves this kind of thing. Not too long ago, the sensation was John Todd and the sinister Illuminati. And Omega is simply another reincarnation of the same archetypal mythos. It is difficult to deal with someone who has a conspiracy mentality, for when you try to disabuse him of it, you only succeed in convincing him that you are a part of the conspiracy," end quote. Johnston closed by calling Omega a mischievous little book that has set church members against each other and deepened suspicions of one another. With a garnish of irony, he concluded, quote, "It is hard to imagine anything better calculated to tear the church apart," end quote. In other words, he may be implying there that Omega is warning of Satan trying to tear the church apart by the introduction of Desmond Ford's ideas and other people's ideas. But in reality, what if the devil is using Omega to rip the church apart? Walter Utt, reviewing Omega's use of history, first commented on the style, again, which Utt called breathless and spooky. Quote, "The style leaves the reader with a delicious feeling of danger and deviltry," end quote. After Utt gives us some examples of how Walton compresses and expands and glosses over swaths of Adventist history, he writes, quote, "The author scarcely hints at the complexity of the issues in Adventist history. It is simply a story of good guys versus bad guys," end quote. Utt was proficient at the zingers. In another place, he writes, quote, "If Walton had not furnished Adventists with an Omega, we would have had to invent one," end quote. Like Johnston, Utt signed off in style. Quote, "It is a sad commentary on the state of Adventism that a work of this low caliber has been raised to such prominence and authority. If historical fiction is an unreliable but gripping mixture of fact and fiction, one of our denominational publishers has produced in Omega a work of historical fiction," end quote. Now, Spectrum did their own interview with Walton, asking him to respond to some of these criticisms, these reviews of his book, and Walton promptly made himself as difficult as possible from the very start. Spectrum asks, "Why did you write Omega?" Walton responds, quote, "My answer to that question starts with a question to you. Why did neither of your book reviewers bother to ask that question or to contact me in any way?" End quote. Does anyone else get the feeling that Lewis Walton would have been at home on a cable news channel today? I don't know which way his politics go. That's not what I mean. But I mean just the punditry kind of doing this verbal jousting on CNN or Fox or whatever right, in American news channels. It feels like he's born for that role, right? Just answer the question, man. Why did you write Omega? Just answer the question instead of taking swipes immediately at the two reviewers. The controversy naturally caused conference leaders some confusion, right? Do you invite him to come speak at camp meeting or not? Was he a heretic? Was he right? The president of Northern New England, in a letter to Bob Spangler, of course, editor of Ministry, said that he greatly appreciated Omega. He asked Spangler what Spangler thought of the book, and more importantly, what did Neil Wilson think of the book? So this brings us back to Neil Wilson. You see, in an article in the review, Neil Wilson asked, "Are leaders too patient?" That's the headline. Quote, "How long should conference, union, or institutional leaders permit the beguiling influence of gifted people to unsettle a church before taking some corrective or remedial action?" End quote. Gee, I wonder what hypothetical, purely imaginary situation this question might be coming from. Of course, I joke. This is a very valid question, right? How long should you tolerate somebody who may be going off track before the church administratively decides to do something? It's a fair question. Neil was no doubt dealing with those who think the church waited too long to fire Desmond Ford, that they had known he was a heretic for years. They would have fired him, way back when. So this perception that church leaders were not diligent watchmen on the walls might erode confidence in their leadership. So Neil is trying to deal with this in his article. He urges his readers in the review to read Lewis Walton's book, for it reminded its readers that, quote, "rebellion and apostasy will be in the very air we breathe," end quote, which I think is Neil's way of saying, we leaders may not be perfect, but we will keep you safe. He's wanting to remind his readers of the danger that's out there, and lest you be tempted to think that your administrators are asleep at the wheel. Just want you to know we're very aware that there's all sorts of heresy and bad ideas out there, and we are trying to keep you safe. So he kind of endorsed Lewis Walton's book, which he must have known was extremely popular among the people that he was trying to convince that the GC is active and vigilant and ready to protect the church. So going back a few months here to the consultation 2, where Neil had been asked about rumors that he was planning to endorse Omega. He said that he read the book while traveling to Russia and had been blessed by it. But he declined to say whether Walton was right in his history or what exactly the Omega was. Like to Neil, that was not the takeaway of the book for him personally. He suggested that he could have deleted any mention of Omega from his article and his point would not have changed, which is definitely true. You can just delete that paragraph. It does not really add or take away anything from the argument. What it does, as I suggested a moment ago, what it does is signal to the conservative church members that Neil is trying to reassure that I know the book that you guys are all reading right now and are excited about. I've read it too. I think it's a great book. I'm with you. I'm on your side. I think that's the only function of that paragraph. Okay? I'm not trying to be uncharitable. I'm not trying to read between the lines. I mean, I am reading between the lines, but I'm not trying to intentionally color this a certain way. I think that's the only explanation for why that the mention of Omega is in that article. It doesn't need to be there. Like I said, you can just delete the whole paragraph. It doesn't change anything. I think it was designed to signal to the people Neil was trying to persuade, the people who would read Omega, that I'm on your side. The General Conference is standing vigilantly on the walls, watching for all sorts of threats, the kinds of threats that Omega is warning you about. However, Neil, in talking with the scholars, realized that maybe I didn't need to write that. And he told them it was too late to prevent it from being published. It had already been sent off. This is in at least a month before publication, but just the way things worked, there was no way for him to retract it now. So did Neil Wilson endorse Omega? Kind of, but knowing what we know from his comments at Consultation 2, it wasn't like a 100% endorsement of Omega. It was something that Neil admitted he could have taken back. Maybe he would have if he had had more time, but it served the practical purpose, I think, for which it was intended. So how does learning about Lewis Walton's Omega help us understand the church today? It certainly wasn't the first or last of its kind, but it illustrates the post-Glacier View fragmentation of this Anglo-Adventist world. Many members have been startled by the succession of traumatic events around 1980, FDR, Ford, Davenport, Ray being the major three. Neil Wilson was clearly concerned about loss of confidence in church leaders and had an incentive to position the church on the side of those disturbed members to reassure them, to provide answers, and to maintain their loyalty during uncertain times. Lewis Walton's Omega helped bring both of those sides together by pointing the finger at Desmond Ford and anyone who would dare to question the church again. Viewed with suspicion under the Pearson administration, many of the scholars at Glacier View hoped the meeting would bring a rapprochement with administrators, but Glacier View ended up driving them further apart. And with many scholars operating now under a cloud of suspicion, the most influential theologians in the church were basically local conference evangelists, media preachers, and authors like Lewis Walton. And if that doesn't seem relevant to today, I don't know what is. A pastor in Watsonville, California, who had gotten a copy of Des's Glacier View manuscript, now believed Des was right, and he was soon to be in trouble. Some of his members were up in arms, especially after he preached a sermon which seemed to question the traditional understanding of Ellen White. And while he was away on vacation, he was accused of embezzling church funds. Yeah, that escalated quickly. Meanwhile, someone preached a sermon in his church from Lewis Walton's Omega, and his members quickly deduced that their pastor was part of the Omega heresy. Okay? So I'm bringing this up because I think people need to understand the real-world impact some of these books and ideas have. Some people are like, you like the book, you don't like the book, read it, don't read it, who cares? But it impacts people's lives, just like this pastor. So his members thought he was part of this Omega heresy, a suspicion which seemed confirmed for them at camp meeting when local church leaders in the Pacific Union Conference announced that if members only had enough money to buy one book, if you could only afford one book, it should be Omega. The camp meeting, the pastor there met with local conference leaders and promised that he could stick with the 27 fundamental beliefs in good faith, and so therefore the pastor could keep his job. But many in the congregation still rejected him, refusing even to shake his hand or allow him to visit in their homes. Members stopped paying tithe, but the conference president said he would not bow to this kind of tactic. Nevertheless, the next day, the conference president called again, saying that the union president had instructed him to, quote-unquote, take care of this situation like a mafia boss. So this conference president met with the pastor, who admitted that he could not teach the traditional view of 1844, but that otherwise he was in harmony with the 27 fundamental beliefs. This wasn't good enough. Pastor said, quote, I refused to resign, however, because I felt that I was not leaving the Adventist Church, but it was leaving me. I had given the best of my life to its ministry, and I was not about to resign, end quote. The pastor then penned an open letter that he had to have known would seal his fate. Quote, I have done the unforgivable thing in bringing this problem out in the open, end quote. The pastor then founded a new congregation outside of the Adventist structure called the Biblical Adventist Church. This is one of those congregational churches. Had about 100 members. 60 of them were Adventists who were likewise frustrated with the state of things. Why am I sharing this story of this one pastor with you? Partially to give you a little update on what this post-Glacier View thing looks like with some of Des Ford's followers. Here's a man who was convinced by Des Ford and ultimately pushed out of the ministry. Here's a congregation that was influenced by Omega and helped push him out of the ministry. But also because his name was Dale Ratzlaff. And Ratzlaff, if you don't know the name, would spend the rest of his life in a so-called ministry to convince Adventists that they don't have the gospel. This, too, is the fruit of Glacier View. Another significant event happened in 1980, which we haven't talked about, and it possibly involves a dingo, probably involves a dingo. Michael and Lindy Chamberlain took their newborn baby to visit Ayers Rock, now called Uluru, in Central Australia. Michael was an Adventist pastor, and this was a camping vacation for the family of 5. To make a long story shorter, Lindy heard a noise and famously cried out, "The dingo's got my baby." Dingo is a kind of wild dog, if you don't know. Hundreds of people began searching for the dingo and the baby to no avail. The baby's clothes were eventually found, but no trace of saliva or hair or anything else that might indicate an animal had taken the baby. The police thought that Lindy, as one of these Adventists, was crazy and probably offered the baby as a child sacrifice. And so Lindy was given a life sentence in prison. She had a baby in prison, which was immediately taken from her. And while she was pardoned a few years later, it wasn't until 2012 that a coroner concluded that a dingo had, in fact, taken the Chamberlains' baby. The story highlights, again, among many other things, the need for religious literacy, the need to understand what different religious people believe so that misconceptions and prejudices don't lead, let's say, people to be arrested for murder because of a mistaken understanding of what they actually believe. Not understanding who Adventists were and what they believed made this case so much worse than it already was, just on a human tragedy level. Now, I'd love to talk about the perception of Adventists in Western society since 1980, but for the sake of time, let's confine it to the relationship between Adventists and evangelicals. Shifting gears a little bit here. There was a lot of soul-searching throughout the 1980s, of course. A piece in Christianity Today in 1984 lamented, quote, "the wall Adventists have built around themselves," end quote, to keep them safe from other Christians. Quote, "For all their talk about being evangelical Christians, Adventists still consider themselves superior to the others," end quote. That's not true, right? We don't think we're better than other people, right? The article hits at the weird reality that Adventists consider themselves part of the larger Christian community. We believe that anyone with faith in Jesus will be saved. You don't have to be Adventist, but generally treats the Christian world as if it's unclean. In Adventism's eschatological worldview, Christianity is divided into Adventists, beastly Catholics, and apostate Protestants. It is one of the dichotomies of Adventism that we believe other Christians are, in fact, our brothers and sisters in Christ, but we would also prefer to stay away from them. Of course, this is not individually true of every Seventh-day Adventist, I'm just speaking in generalities here. CT reported that when an Adventist university was given the option to join an intervarsity Bible study at a neighboring school, the Adventists declined to participate. But it should be noted that the wall was porous in places. CT also reported that Andrews University Bookstore was one of InterVarsity Press's top academic customers. Desmond Ford appeared on the Baptist John Ankerberg's show in 1982 with Walter Ray. There were 5 Adventist leaders that Ankerberg invited, but all of whom declined to go on the show. And that left basically one former Adventist and an Adventist who had been fired to explain Adventism to a largely evangelical audience. Des, as was his way, began with charm, telling Ankerberg, quote, "You said you were not a Seventh-day Adventist. I accept that apology. I am one, and I love the church," end quote. In 1985, Bill Johnson, then editor of the Adventist Review, did join John Ankerberg's show alongside Walter Martin, who had grown concerned that the Adventist Church had repudiated questions on doctrine. 30 years after the Adventist Evangelical Dialogues, here was Walter Martin sitting down with another Adventist leader, wondering if the deal they struck in the mid-1950s still held true. Martin had posed 3 questions to Neil Wilson, but Neil had apparently passed them off to somebody else, who passed them off to somebody else. Martin's first question was, do you still hold to questions on doctrine? Second, is Ellen White an infallible interpreter of the Bible? Third, why did the church let questions on doctrine go out of print? Bill Johnson, suddenly on the hot seat to speak for the entire denomination, affirmed that yes, the church still holds the QOD. No, Ellen White is not an infallible interpreter of the Bible. That's when Martin pounced, throwing quotes from the Review and the White Estate that seemed to suggest otherwise. Martin was his usual pugnacious self. He was worried that the hundreds of church employees leaving the church in the post-Glacier View years were being kicked out for being gospel-oriented Adventists. That's the lens through which Walter Martin saw the post-Glacier View years in Adventism. Johnson, who was clearly not ready for a brawl, was on defense the entire time. John Ankerberg threw a curveball and here and there, and in one case he said that he had Johnson respond to some of Walter Ray's and Desmond Ford's arguments as well. The longer it went on, the more Ankerberg and Martin just walked all over Bill Johnson, who struggled to get more than a sentence out at a time. Another curveball came when the audience was invited to ask questions of Bill Johnson. One audience member declared that Adventists were afraid of Ellen White, and Johnson responded, "No, sir, we are not afraid of Ellen White." But the audience member just kept going, insisting that Adventists were afraid of Ellen White. And then Martin went back on the warpath. Now, these are direct quotes here, but I'm not going to say quote unquote. Okay. Martin, but are you in Christ? Johnson, I'm in Christ, yes. Martin, are your sins blotted out? Johnson, Jesus has taken care of my sins. Martin, are they blotted out? Come on. Johnson, my sins are forgiven. Martin, are they blotted out? Johnson, let me finish my parable. Martin, the defense rests. Now, of course, this conversation is out of context, right? I'm not explaining the parable that Johnson was trying to draw from, but it just gives you an indication of this rapid-fire, interrogative style that Walter Martin had. And of course, he was now convinced that legalists had taken over the Adventist Church, and he said that he longed for the days of Leroy Froome and Roy Allen Anderson. Bill Johnson's Ankerberg interview wasn't Adventism at its ecumenical best. I think it represents the way Adventists have often done some of these goodwill tours without much goodwill, like kind of reluctantly, kind of half-heartedly walking into situations, not fully prepared for them. And that was certainly true of the Adventist evangelical conferences in the 1950s, but the Adventists quickly recovered and did what needed to be done from their perspective to have a good relationship with Walter Martin and Donald Gray Barnhouse. Now, after Walter Martin's death, his colleague Donald Gray Barnhouse had died back in 1960, you'd think the issue might die down. But Ken Samples, a colleague of Walter Martin's, picked up the mantle instead. In an article for Christianity Today in 1990, Samples recognized that, quote, a problem in past evangelical evaluations of Adventism has been the failure to recognize its theological diversity, end quote. That's 100% true. In a particularly uncomfortable comparison, Samples said Adventism was as diverse as American Catholicism. Sure, that makes the Adventists happy. And the open question was which group, Samples identified three, the legalists, the evangelicals, and the liberals, would prevail inside the Adventist Church. Now, we have to remember where Samples and Christianity Today are coming from. Okay, both are evangelical, believing they have the gospel, and so Adventism's factions are evaluated based on how evangelical they are. The evangelical movement was predominantly and comfortably white at that time. The same issue of Christianity Today that has Ken Samples' article also asked, quote, do blacks want to be evangelical, end quote. So Adventism's diversity may have, shall we say, colored their assessment at times. What I guess I'm saying is that we shouldn't be too worried about one group claiming Adventism doesn't have the gospel if their gospel only seems to reach one particular group of people. Samples is correct, however, that Adventism in the late 1970s was at a crossroads. The church could have gone several ways, but choices that church leaders made circa 1980, and not just leaders, but members as well, are still directing the church today. I'll give you an example before we move on. And that's the emphasis on fundamental beliefs. While these beliefs have existed in list form, in some form or fashion for many, many decades, they weren't seen as the definitive test of fellowship for employees and members. In 1920, R.A. Underwood proposed a list of 11 questions to be asked of someone wanting baptism. The first question was, have you accepted Jesus as your personal Savior and His Word as your teacher? Underwood did ask in question 11, the very final question, if the candidate was in harmony with the teaching of Seventh-day Adventists, but this teaching wasn't spelled out. Since 1980, we have seen this expanded articulation of fundamental Adventist theology play a greater role in the life of the church as a safeguard against future Desmond Fords. In other words, people haven't talked about fundamental beliefs more before 1980 than they did after 1980. They've taken a much more prominent, authoritative place in the life of the church since Desmond Ford, since they were first passed at the General Conference session there in April 1980. In 2007, at a conference commemorating the 50th anniversary of Questions on Doctrine, I was there. Kenneth Samples penned an essay talking about his own relationship with Walter Martin, the 1950s meetings, and Martin's concerns about Seventh-day Adventism in the 1980s. Samples made it clear that one of Walter Martin's last wishes was to write another book on Adventism, and that Samples himself planned to write that book. It's unclear to me if he ever did. Should we be happy that Walter Martin didn't write one more version of a book on Adventists before he died? If I'm honest, it's a little relief. I don't know what he would have said. It's hard to say where the relationship between Adventists and evangelicals are today. I believe the relationship that they have is much better today, despite the Ford affair and Walter Martin's fear that Adventism had taken a legalistic tone. Why do I think it's better? Well, certainly the culture of the Anglosphere has changed, and fewer Christians, it seems, are as pugnacious about doctrine as they used to be. That might be a double-edged sword. Perhaps there is a growing awareness that internecine conflicts distract from the greater threat that churches face in secularism. But there are still plenty of evangelicals willing to pick up Walter Martin's mantle and claim that Adventists are not Christians. With the death of Dale Ratzlaff, his work has been continued by successors, just as samples tried to carry on Walter Martin's legacy. But you'll note, I think, in both cases that the fervor and the fire and the popularity just isn't what it used to be. Now we have people on YouTube. At this moment in American politics and culture, I don't know that Adventists are as eager as they once were to be seen as evangelicals. I think it's always been appropriate to check the assumption that evangelicals have the gospel figured out, and all that remains is for Adventists to be like them in some way. Nevertheless, you can still find plenty of evangelicals, like I said, getting clicks on YouTube for saying that Adventists are in a cult. Despite a recent embrace of Adventism as a fruitful field of scholarly inquiry, something I talked about in an extra episode at the American Society for Church History, you will find that, I don't know, for most people, I think Adventism lurks just out of their peripheral view. They've maybe heard of it, but they don't really know an Adventist, don't really know what they're all about. Adventism is a little bit more mainstream than it used to be, but still kind of strange in some way that many people cannot articulate. So long as Adventism occupies that location at the periphery, people will be curious to understand that friend of a friend who's an Adventist, and so there will always be those who show up offering to explain that strangeness on YouTube in exchange for some likes and some clicks. But let's talk about this again in 30 years when I retire, and I'm sure we'll understand it much better. Let's shift gears, talk about something a number of you have asked me to talk about in this episode: women's ordination. Oh, boy, I don't want to get into this again. Women's ordination as elders and pastors could be an entire season of this podcast. Hint, hint. So let's keep it simple for now. And by simple, I mean still pretty long. I avoided this topic throughout both seasons of the Adventist History Podcast because the flow of that story didn't really match the flow of the story we're telling. What I mean is that in order to tell that story of women's ordination, you kind of have to start in the 1800s. And so far, to be up to date, you're going to finish in the 2000s. So when you're telling a story that every episode is just moving us forward year by year, it's hard to stop and say, now let's tell this story that spans 150 years. It kind of breaks you out of the chronology. And plus, kicking it over to another season all by itself enables us to spend a lot more time on it as well, because I think this is one of those topics, the details kind of matter. The first thing we need to understand is that the ordination of women as elders or pastors is a different issue from whether or not women should be elders or pastors. Okay, I've noticed this get conflated so many times where people say, well, the church does not support women's ordination, therefore a woman should not be an elder. Two separate issues. We're talking about ordination in particular. In Adventist history, there are many, many women who have served in pastoral roles, chaplaincy roles, and other leadership roles in the church. While the ordination of women was considered in the 1800s, especially at the 1881 General Conference session, I really want to begin our story in the early 1970s when Josephine Benton was ordained as a local church elder. Benton, who only passed away in January 2025, had found 50 other women who had been licensed ministers between 1870 and 1973. And after her ordination, she asked a senior pastor at Sligo Church, quote, "If you ever want a woman on your pastoral staff, let me know," end quote. She thought the pastor would laugh at her, but he took her seriously, and she joined the pastoral staff at Sligo. As one person had said, quote, "In 1973, Josephine was, to SDA ministry what Jackie Robinson was to all-white baseball in 1947, end quote. 1973 also hosted one of the historic conferences on women in the Adventist Church. This is the Role of Women in the Church Committee that met at Camp Mohaven in Ohio. Established by the General Conference, 10 men and 15 women met to present and discuss papers, because what else does the church do to have a good time? So while the meeting wasn't about ordination per se, of course it was brought up, it was talked about. You obviously can't get to ordination without first understanding the role of women and the role that they should play in the church, I should say. The running and outspoken and charming professor who wrote one of my favorite books any Adventist has ever written, just as from a readership enjoyment perspective, she cut to the heart of the discussion when she quoted somebody as saying, quote, "We can produce no positive theological case for ordaining Scotsmen. By a clear oversight on the part of God, they were not represented among the apostolic band. But the extension of the church to the Gentiles cleared the way for the ordaining of people of all nations. The same extension of the church to total humanity is, surely, the basis for opening the possibility of ordination to total humanity," end quote. Raoul Dederin found no theological reason for women not to be ordained, but he thought the entire concept of ordination needed to be reconsidered. He asked, why we ordain people to pastoral ministry but not to teaching ministry? Why do we not ordain people who use their other gifts for ministry? To reduce this issue to whether or not to ordain women risked, as he sought, to perpetuate this separation of pastoral ministry from all other kinds of ministries, and thus the separation from pastoral giftedness as a spiritual gift from other kinds of gifts that God gives. Not everyone at Mohaven was convinced by either argument. Obviously, men and women alike made the case that women can minister just fine without seeking ordination. So we had these three groups emerge out of Mohaven. We had the group that was pro-women's ordination, a group that was against women's ordination, and then a group that was maybe hesitantly or qualified pro-women's ordination, but really wanted us to send a step back and just have a conversation about ordination, period, before we get into women's ordination. Maybe we need to revisit what ordination is, the role it plays in the church, and whether we should even ordain men, right? The Mohaven Committee report asserted that, quote, "We see no significant theological objection to the ordination of women to church ministries," end quote. The 1973 annual council basically said, slow down. They sent the Mohaven report to each division, asked them to study it during the next year, and come back with notes. The same council also said that a married woman's first ministry was to her home and family, but that women should be credentialed when they do pastoral evangelistic work. The next year, the 1974 annual council tried to put a plug in the discussion. Quote, "Because a survey of its world divisions reveals that the time is not ripe nor opportune, therefore in the interest of the world unity of the church, no move be made in the direction of ordaining women to the gospel ministry," end quote. Prexad, however, was asked to study it further. The 1975 spring meeting decided that women should be able to serve as ordained deacons. Furthermore, they urged that, quote, "the greatest discretion and caution be exercised in the ordaining of women to the office of local elder," end quote. Nevertheless, they stopped short of supporting ordaining women to the pastoral ministry because, quote, "we believe that the world church is not yet ready to move forward. Therefore, until this question becomes clearer, we recommend that every endeavor be made to use women in the numerous positions many of them are well qualified to fill," end quote. So let's catch our breath here. What you're seeing is two different things kind of happening at the same time. One, we're not ready to move forward on women's ordination to pastoral ministry because the world church is not ready for it. This is the thing we're hearing year after year throughout the 1970s. But at the same time, it's not like they're only saying that and doing nothing else. You also hear some of these meetings say, we need to find other roles for women to occupy in the church, leadership positions and whatnot. So we're kind of having both things where we want to encourage women to occupy prominent leadership positions in the church, but we're not ready to talk about the ordination of pastoral ministry. They can be ordained elders, they can be ordained deacons, but let's hold off on the pastor part of this. The complicating factor was the IRS, which is always a complicating factor. The IRS, for those who don't know, because you are blessed, is the tax collecting entity in the United States. Because these female pastors would not be eligible, and I'm not talking about ordained female pastors, just female pastors, right? Ordination is a separate issue from being a pastor. Because these female pastors would not be eligible for parsonage exclusion, among other tax benefits, because they're not ordained clergy, and the IRS seems to have defined ordained clergy as those with the authority to administer communion and officiate at weddings, then they're at a serious tax disadvantage here compared to their male colleagues. The IRS could not navigate each church's theology of ordination, right? So it settled on an ordained pastor having the authority to do those two things. The pressure from the IRS helped push the 1976 Annual Council to allow licensed ministers in certain circumstances to perform the functions of the ordained minister. So what we're seeing here is, even when we're not comfortable yet with women being ordained as pastors, we can't have a situation tax-wise. It would be unfair for them to have to pay taxes their male colleagues don't pay just simply because of we're not giving them the ordination certificate, right? So there was a move then to allow these women to perform certain of these functions, and by that I think we're talking about weddings in particular, perhaps baptisms. We're allowing them to perform some of these functions that otherwise only ordained ministers could do for tax purposes. Okay, we're letting them have a little bit more authority as non-ordained ministers doing some ordained things in order to qualify for these tax privileges. The 1975 spring meeting also made a recommendation to stop giving ministerial licenses to women, which they had been receiving for more than 100 years, because as the 1977 Annual Council explained, quote, when a conference gives a young man a ministerial license, it should be recognized as a pledge on the part of the conference leadership to foster that worker's growth, end quote. The license was an opportunity for the worker to prove their calling, with the implication being that when that calling was satisfactorily demonstrated, the worker would be ordained. Right? There was an expectation. You're not guaranteed that you're going to be ordained, but you're on that path. And by giving these same credentials to women, we're establishing expectations that we're not sure we're able to meet. We're at that point unwilling to meet those expectations. So some wanted to stop giving women ministerial licenses. The 1977 Annual Council decided to call female pastors. They started this program called Associates in Spiritual Care, and they were granted commissioned minister licenses. The council thus formalized a 2-track ministerial system. So women were on this commissioned path, men were on this ordained path. That same year, the director of the Biblical Research Institute said that after 4 years of study since Mohaven, quote, the work done over a period of several years by the BRI and an associated study committee provide the consensus of those involved that there is neither theological mandate nor objection to ordination of women to any level of responsibility for which ordination is indicated, end quote. In other words, the Bible does not really say anything for or against the ordination of women. At first, GC leaders refused to take this issue to the floor of a session where delegates from the World Church could vote on it. But pressure for this was growing, as there were, by the early 1980s, about 1,000 women ordained as local elders, with others now graduating from seminary and taking pastorates. In 1984, after 3 female pastors conducted baptisms under the blessing of the Potomac Conference, the issue became a hot topic again. The GC intervened, asking Potomac to hold off on issuing ministerial licenses to these women. The GC promised that it would establish a pathway for this issue to get to the GC session. The more the issue was talked about, the more confusing and frustrating it seemed to become. In 1985, the North American Division was asked to sort this out. The women serving as associates in pastoral care had been prohibited from baptizing or officiating weddings, as a normal part of their duties. But the NAD moved to drop these prohibitions. If the associate had done well, after 5 years, they could be considered for a commissioning service instead of ordination. The 1985 GC session adopted a recommendation from the 1984 Annual Council that no action be taken on this issue until it could be studied further. Now, if you've been listening closely, you have heard year after year the bold decision to wait, to study, to wait, to study, to wait, to study. The confusion was in part due to the conflicting messages the church kept sending. Ordination was off the table because the church wasn't ready, which implied that the church wasn't against the ordination of women as pastors, but just, the timing isn't right. Nevertheless, women should be ordained as elders and allowed to pastor churches, just unordained. And these women, little by little over the years, have been granted nearly the same ecclesiastical powers as ordained men. So at some point, you got to ask the question, what is the point of maintaining these two tracks anymore? If you're going to allow female pastors to do almost everything you allow a male ordained pastor to do, and you don't see any theological barriers between the two, why not just end this kind of fictitious situation we have created and just allow them to both be ordained? This isn't to say that the historical and theological arguments were not being advanced. It wasn't entirely a pragmatic thing. There were plenty of people out there who thought they had biblical evidence one way or the other, or historical evidence one way or the other. Bert Holoviak offered a 34-page paper in 1985 arguing from Adventist history in favor of women's ordination. And in 1987, a newly independent Adventist ministry was formed. The 1980s were a time for independent ministries in the Adventist Church, a lot of them coming to fruition during that decade. This, too, is the fruit of Glacier View. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to talk about this. But anyways, a new Adventist independent ministry was formed called Adventist Affirm to articulate an opposition to women's ordination. The ministry was led by William Fagel, who was the founder, the pioneer of Adventism's Faith for Today TV program back in 1950. It also had Mervyn Maxwell and Samuel Bakioki on the job. In 1989, dozens of church leaders from around the world gathered for the Cohutta Springs meetings in Georgia. They approved a document, 56-11, that concluded that the world church was not ready for women's ordination. Right there we have it again. And a group of women at Cohutta Springs formed their own ad hoc committee and asked for, among other things, a female GC vice president, which would come a couple decades later. The two documents were submitted to the 1989 Annual Council, which synthesized them into a new document that basically contained the highlights from each and was in turn recommended to the 1990 General Conference session. The document notably did not recommend the ordination of women to the gospel ministry, but it did try to separate women's ordination from the larger point that, hey, we need to consider women for more jobs in the church. Kit Watts wrote an article for Ministry showing the collapse of women in positions of leadership from 30 conference executive secretaries in 1905 to 0 30 years later, or going from 19 conference treasurers in 1905 to 0 just after World War II. Women's ordination was thus situated as a part of a much larger problem of women being pushed out of leadership roles in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. At the 1990 General Conference session, the delegates voted on the document, which said what everyone knew. While many members of the NAD were ready, the World Church was not. Quote, in view of the widespread lack of support for the ordination of women to the gospel ministry, and in view of the possible risk of disunity, dissension, and diversion from the mission of the church, we do not approve the ordination of women to the gospel ministry. End quote. So a point I want to make here, just because we have some people, ministries arguing for or against, offering theological or historical reasons to ordain, to not ordain, notice that in these official decisions being made by the General Conference or by the General Conference session, theological reasons are not offered as a reason not to ordain women. It is always that the time is not right. Another reason was given in 1990, however, and that is that ordination in the Adventist Church qualified someone to be a pastor anywhere in the world. Your ordination in Australia would be recognized in Kenya. To ordain women, therefore, would break that system because there would be large swaths of the world which would not accept the ordination of a female. The vote approving this document and affirming this decision was made 1,173 to 377. Notably absent from the decision, as I was mentioning, was the claim that the Bible or Ellen White was against women's ordination. These two reasons were given. I'll call it the pragmatic reason that the world wasn't ready, and that is accompanied by the assumption that the church should move together on this issue. So that's the pragmatic reason, and then the organizational reason, which is that it would change how the church understands ordination. both of those factors could change. Neither one of those are absolute kind of line in the sand. Here we stand, we can do no other. So even though the General Conference said no in 1990, it wasn't a hard no. It was more of a not yet. No promise that eventually they would change their mind, but certainly this wasn't the end of this issue. Following the other recommendations in the document, the 1990 GC session did allow female ministers to officiate at weddings and also reversed a statement in the manual not allowing deaconesses to be ordained. Over the next 5 years, a flood of new books on the subject of women's ordination were published, both for and against. Delegates arrived at the 1995 GC session in Utrecht, thus had the opportunity to be better informed on the issue, and perhaps there was some optimism that now that people had time to read the best arguments on both sides, that a better decision could be made. Side note, you wonder what would have happened if the same thing had been done with Desmond Ford's points or anybody else's points. Notice the church is willing to offer resources and to publish resources on both sides of this issue. But rather than revisit the vote of the previous GC session, this time the issue was more specific. It was whether or not to grant the North American division the right to authorize the ordination of women in their territory. So this proposal solved the pragmatic objection, right? We can ordain women in North America, and even if you object to it over there, we're not trying to affect you with this policy. It's not a church-wide policy where now everyone can ordain women. We're just asking for it to be the case in our specific territory. So that solves the pragmatic objection. It does not solve the organizational objection. You're still going to be ordaining women whose ordination is not going to be accepted around the world, thus changing the meaning of ordination, because by practice, ordination is a universal status in the Adventist Church. Alfred C. McClure, who was a new NAD president in 1990, made an appeal to the 1994 annual council with the NAD's proposal. Now, this appeal was printed in full in the Review in February 1995. Again, strange thing if you're used to talking about Desmond Ford. It's strange that the appeal of somebody who wants to change the church is published in the Review. But anyways, he suggested that following the General Conference's own votes to allow ordained women to serve as elders back in 1974, quote, I have come to the conclusion that the church crossed the theological bridge when we voted to recognize the ordination of women as local elders. For while admitting that there is a clear distinction in function, it appears to be ecclesiological hair-splitting to say that we will recognize the ordination of women on one hand and refuse to recognize it on the other hand, while calling both of them scriptural positions. End quote. In other words, we're saying that we have the authority, the biblical warrant to ordain women as deacons and as elders, but we don't have that same biblical authority to ordain them as pastors. How can we say both of these things are biblical positions? McClure said that it was too late to turn back now. Women are already in the seminary. They're already pastoring churches. They're already serving chaplains. They're already ordained elders. Not because North America has wanted to run ahead of the world church, but based on the General Conference's own votes over the past 20 years. As he put it, quote, because this division has applied these GC actions in a way that was felt to be in harmony with policy and was fair and right, we now find ourselves in a position that is seen by many in this division as discriminatory, unethical, and even immoral, end quote. McClure's arguments were clear. Number one, the church has never officially recognized a theological reason why women cannot be ordained as pastors. Number two, the church has established two ministerial tracks that are confusing and unjust and logically indefensible. 3, we already have 1,000 ordained female elders. The church cannot practically argue that women shouldn't be ordained and then tell those elders that God never called them, right? Like, how can you say God never called a woman to be an ordained pastor, but he called them to be an ordained elder? It's too late. You cannot seriously argue that women can be ordained as elders, but not as pastors. 4, because we have 20 years of seeing the ministry of women as elders and as unordained pastors, look, no disaster has befallen us. It's worked out just fine. We have evidence that God has blessed those churches where women have been in these leadership roles. It's not like, God has withdrawn his blessing from us since the 1970s. And, and we're all falling apart because we made this decision. So therefore, If we don't know what the Bible says, just look at, we've cast our fleece out, right? We've tried it and just said, let's see if the Lord blesses us or not. And his argument was that God has blessed us just fine. The 1995 General Conference session still said no. Spoiler alert. It was 1,481 to 673. Divisions would not be permitted to determine their own ordination policy. Now, some thought the issue was finally settled, but undeterred, the Sligo Church ordained 3 women on September 23rd, Kendra Holoviak, Penny Schell, and Norma Osborne. Several other churches followed suit that year. Books kept emerging. In 1998, Andrews University Press published Women in Ministry, in support of women's ordination, and this was the work of a committee of 15 or so, which the dean of the seminary had set up. Adventist Affirm followed it up with their book against women's ordination, Prove All Things. One of the greatest champions against women's ordination during the late 1990s and early 2000s was Samuel Korangtang Pippin, which, boy, that's aged well. He was joined by Gerard and Laurel Damstedt, the leaders of 3ABN, and popular preachers like Doug Batchelor as well. In 2010, the General Conference President Jan Paulsen asked 2 questions of Prexad. First, would your field accept the ordination of women? Second, in what ways would the mission of the church in your field be negatively impacted if other parts of the world decided to ordain women? Only 3 of the 13 world divisions said they were ready to ordain women. 8 said they would not. Thus, the issue would not appear on the agenda for the 2010 General Conference session. Nevertheless, a new effort was put in motion to study the issue and report to the 2015 General Conference session. Yay, more waiting and studying. Seriously, folks, the early Adventist church embraced every distinctive doctrine combined with less study than they put into this issue. The NAD began probing 4 ways around the impasse. They passed a working policy change allowing commissioned women to serve as conference presidents, but annual council voted it down and the NAD backed down. In the early 2010s, some unions decided it was better to ask for forgiveness than permission and began ordaining female pastors. Paulsen was out at the 2010 session, with Ted Wilson taking his place. Yes, Ted, son of Neil, allowed the study of ordination to continue. He urged everyone to wait until the study was complete. Again, nothing new there. This time, the Columbia Union didn't wait. Despite Ted Wilson's personal appeal, on July 29, 2012, the union's constituency voted 209 to 51 to authorize ordination to the gospel ministry without regard to gender. Pacific Union did the same, again with Ted Wilson in attendance to make a personal appeal. Meanwhile, the 106-member Theology of Ordination Study Committee met twice in 2013 and 2014. These 3 positions emerged from those TOSC meetings. One was for women's ordination, of course. One was against women's ordination, of course. And a third position which affirmed male headship in the home and the church, but believed that women might be ordained under certain circumstances, such as, no qualified males being available. They weren't absolutists about male headship. That is, hey, an unqualified male is not preferable to a qualified female. Okay? Which is to say, not ordaining women is the norm, but it's not an absolute. We should be flexible in certain circumstances. The third position also supported local areas of the church determining what ordination policy worked best for them. Again, we should be pragmatic, we should be flexible. The 2014 annual council voted to put a question to the floor of the 2015 GC session. After reading all of these TOSC papers, is it acceptable for divisions to allow for the ordination of women in their territories? And this time, in 2015, friends, the General Conference session said no. I'm sorry, I'm acting like this is like a big surprise. But this time it was 1,381 to 977. This is a 59 to 41% vote. This is a surreal thing to report because I, many of you who are listening, perhaps were there for that vote. I was there. I was sitting there in the stadium, listening to this debate, watching this vote transpire. And it feels weird to talk about something happening on this podcast that I actually experienced. It is noteworthy to note that all 3 of these General Conference session votes in 90, 95, and 2015, the vote has gotten closer each time, even as the share of delegates from North America or Europe or Australia has gotten fewer and fewer each time. Just think that's interesting. I don't know where it's going, but it's interesting. Once again, after 2015, several unions decided to ordain women anyway, and that's largely where we are at today. Okay. Clearly, the women's ordination issue is something the church organization has been unable to digest in a healthy way. So many meetings kicked the can down the road by urging patience, promising study, and often not filling that promise. The church employed its usual mechanisms, gathering scholars and administrators, presenting papers, having votes. But what do these mechanisms matter if a large number of members won't accept the results? Most members accepted the decision to fire Desmond Ford, even if a vocal minority howled about it. Likewise with QOD. Women's ordination, while drawn out over decades, wasn't that different from the Desmond Ford situation. In both cases, there was no scholarly consensus, no clear "thus saith the Lord" that emerged that church leaders could use to base a decision upon. The decision was made administratively to side with the majority of the world church to avoid making a change. That's not some crippling indictment of church leadership. That's human nature. Speaking of Neil Wilson, the 1990 GC session proved to be an unwelcome surprise for him. By all accounts, Wilson was ready to continue for a third term, and so this has been the first time since A.G. Daniels in 1922 that a sitting president who was willing to continue serving hadn't been nominated. The nominating committee in 1990 initially nominated George Brown, then president of the Inter-American Division, and he would have been the first black Adventist to be a General Conference president. After beating Wilson on a ballot in the nominating committee about 130 to 81, he nevertheless turned it down. There's a lot of inside baseball rumors and reports here about who said what during this nominating committee, but I don't think it's worth reporting on all of that. The nominating committee then chose their own chair, the Carolina Conference president, Robert Falkenberg, to replace Wilson as GC president. Falkenberg had been chosen by Neil Wilson to chair the committee, and he seemed to have narrowly prevailed over Jan Paulsen, then president of the Trans-European Division, in order to gain the nomination. Falkenberg had deep ties to the Inter-American Division, where his parents had been missionaries. He had also spent most of his career there, and he could speak Spanish. It seems that Falkenberg had pushed for Wilson until he realized the resistance on the nominating committee was too strong. Clearly, the committee wanted someone with ties to the Inter-American Division. Back in 1989, Falkenberg had written a controversial article for Ministry entitled "Church Structure, Servant or Master." He argued for organizational change, drawing from the religious leaders in the time of Jesus, saying, quote, "These leaders came to regard them as an end in themselves, and so they took as their primary objective the maintenance of the church structure," end quote. Falkenberg introduced a phrase, the iron law of oligarchy, to explain the stage of an organization where, quote, "the preservation of the structure gradually overtakes mission as its predominant concern," end quote. This iron law of oligarchy was something that needed to be opposed. Quote, "No one should necessarily equate questioning the status quo with rebelling against the church," end quote. Falkenberg was explicit that this article was not intended to criticize Neil Wilson's administration, but it was undoubtedly seen that way by a number of people. Did his article, which might have destroyed his chances at senior church leadership before, actually pave his way for the presidency? People who wanted change thought they found an agent of change in Robert Falkenberg? Possibly, but there were also a lot of other factors at play here. Clearly, Central and South America wanted the change for their own reasons as well. Perhaps even because of how Neil Wilson tolerated the NAD's push for women's ordination. The GC was also experiencing financial hardships, and there were other factors that may have led delegates to look away from Neil Wilson and that made Robert Falkenberg attractive as a candidate. His administration, however, collapsed after a former business partner sued him and the GC, alleging that $8 million had been stolen from him. The whole thing was a mess. I'm not going to get into it. It ended with Falkenberg resigning on February 7th, 1999. Unfortunately, I have to keep moving. I can't do justice to Falkenberg's entire presidency and talk about all the other things he did. And I'm sorry, I'm not giving you the whole picture here, but look, there's plenty of things online you can read about. Less than a month later, on March 1st, 1999, Jan Paulsen was elected General Conference president. Paulson was the third non-American GC president, joining his fellow Norwegian O.A. Olsen, who was president from 1888 to 1897, and Charles H. Watson, who was an Australian and was president from 1930 to 1936. As I noted when discussing women's ordination, Paulson was replaced in 2010 by Ted Wilson, who is still the General Conference president 15 years later as of the recording of this episode. But hey, there's a GC session in a few months from now, and anything can happen. This may be a very out-of-date part of the episode very quickly, or maybe it won't be. In a way, it seems that we've come full circle back to Glacier View. We have a Wilson in office. I should probably wrap this up. I hope Season 2 helps you understand a little bit more of how the church has ended up the way that it has. I hope it helps you see why Adventism is the way that it is. In my opinion, we are still in the shadow of the questions raised about Ellen White and inspiration at the 1919 Bible Conference. We're still in the shadow of 1888 in the meaning of righteousness by faith. We're still in the shadow of the issues raised during the Ford, Davenport, Ray era, issues about hermeneutics and trust and what it means to be a global church family. Above all, I think, Adventists are still in the shadow of 1844, trying to figure out what it means to be waiting for Jesus to come, 181 years and counting. The church that we have wasn't built for the world that we have. But what church is? We've struggled to change and adapt, but what church hasn't? This podcast has taught me to be frustrated with the church. I've seen more faults and foibles than I ever imagined existed in the church, but it's also taught me to be patient with the church. We all think the church would be better if it just listened to me. But if the church did just what I wanted it to do, would it still be the church? Change is warranted. It's necessary. It's long overdue, and it's critical to the church's survival. Change will almost always be a hard, long, excruciating fight. But I've come to appreciate that the fight for change, to make the church more faithful, more just, more loving, more gospel-centered, isn't just about getting those outcomes, right? It doesn't stand or fall in whether or not I succeed in making the church that way. Rather, I think the fight for those things is a good in and of itself. The fight should make me more faithful, more just, more loving, more gospel-centered. And in that case, I don't mind being patient. I love the church, even if I don't always feel loved by the church. That's not okay. And it's also kind of okay. The church is exhausting. I am tired of talking about policies and votes and papers being presented. I'm tired of hearing about what so-and-so at the General Conference is really like, or who secretly did this or that. But sometimes all of that just melts away when someone walks up to me in a local church, shakes my hand, and says, "Happy Sabbath." Isn't that the church? Even more so than the magazines and the institutions and the policies that are passed. I feel like I should distill all that I've learned into some special insight for you right now. Truly, I don't feel like I've thought enough about the history of the Adventist Church to offer such insight. After 10 and a half years, doing 2 seasons of this podcast, I can finally say that the first draft is done. After all of this work, month after month, in 127 episodes, I feel like I'm just getting started. I began this podcast so I could learn about Adventist history. And I'm thankful for all of you who has joined me in this journey. Still, I feel like there's still so much to learn. That's why I'm excited about future seasons of this show. I want to break from the chronological story that I've been doing for a decade, and I want the opportunity to do some deeper dives into other subjects that I could only just touch on. I don't know what Season 3 will be about or when it will come out at this point. I'm going to take a mental vacation for a couple of months, then I'm going to redo Season 1. And when Season 3 is done, it will appear right here where you've always been listening to this podcast. After all of this work, I can say that I'm still curious about Adventist history. I'm still in love with it. I still want to understand these people. I still think having a working knowledge of Adventist history is super important, helping us learn how to live Adventistly in the 21st century. So, my friend, I think we're just getting started. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening. Pat yourself on the back. Print off an honorary degree. I hope this podcast has helped you as much as it has helped me. This podcast has changed my life because you listened. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I don't know most of you, but I love you. So we'll talk again, Padawan. Come on. You don't think I could close out season 2 without one more Star Wars reference, did you?